Okay, we are live on YouTube.
Okay, welcome to all. Today we have Fiore Longo. We have a seminar about from green colonialism to the commodification of nature, protected areas versus indigenous territories. Fiore Longo is an Italian cultural anthropologist. She works at Survival International, a global movement for tribal people rights. It is a researcher and advocacy officer, and she is also the director of Survival International for France and Spain. She coordinated the survival conservation campaign and has visited many communities in Africa and Asia where indigenous people face the fight for their rights. She also visited indigenous community in Colombia and worked for activities to support the right of uncontacted peoples. She is involved for many years in the campaign Decolonize Conservation of Survival, and she prepared and coordinated an interesting guide in 2022, a guide to decolonize language and conservation prepared by Survival. It is interesting because if you open this booklet, it's very interesting, easy to read. You find immediately a sentences of a Maasai leader of Loliondo saying, "Your conservation areas are war zone for us." I think this is a very good summary of what happened in conservation areas. Fiore wrote in 2023 a book on decolonized conservation, global voice for indigenous self-determination, land and world in common, and also a book in French, Décolonisant la protection de la nature, plaidoyer pour les peuples autochtones et l'environnement. I think this contribution is very important in continuity with the reflection of yesterday about the nature metrics, and especially to see how practices of conservation are embodying a lot of colonization practice. So we need to decolonize it. So I let the floor to Fiore Longo. We are very happy to have Fiore here with us. Please, Fiore, the floor is yours.
Hello everyone. Buongiorno. Thank you very much for this invitation. I'm very happy to talk to you today. We will go through we will try to do this journey into nature conservation from the origins or the creation of the conservation movement until today. And I will share some a PowerPoint presentation with you. Then there will be time for questions. So if you don't understand something or you have a question or also a comment, you can, I will leave the floor later. I also will leave you my email after the conference. If I forget, just remind me. So if you think about it later and you have questions, you can also reach out to me. Okay, I will share the presentation. Hopefully everything, the technology will be great. Just I can't. Oh, voila. Okay, you see, right? The big two hands survival logo.
Perfect.
Great. So first I will explain you where I come from, what my organization, the organization I work with is, so you understand also our point of view. I think it's important to explain that we are not academic. So the stories I'm going to tell you are from the field. We are a campaigning organization. Survival International is the global movement for indigenous people's rights. And what we do is to try radically to change public opinion, the idea that people, like common people, have about indigenous people. So we fight against racism, we do field trips, we go to visit the communities, we bring and collect information on human rights abuses, and then bring it usually to the Western countries where the roots of most of the crimes against indigenous peoples are. And we try to convince the public to act in favor of indigenous people, doing actions that can be sending emails, but can also be doing a protest. It can also be writing letters. One time, that was what we mostly did, but also informing people about the problems that indigenous peoples are facing. So we are activists. I think it's very important to say that our goal is always to defend indigenous people's rights. So that is the main thing we do. The information I'm going to share with you comes from my field trips as the direct contact with indigenous people. And we have been doing this for 50 years. That's also important to say. One of our main campaigns is called Decolonize Conservation. And I decided today to, I put this subtitle, there is some quote from Emmanuel, who is a pastoralist in the North Kenya, because when I talked to him in Kenya the first time, and we were discussing about conservation and now the new ways that conservation is done and funded, which is mainly and mostly through carbon credits. He said that he didn't understand what a carbon project was, but what he knows for sure is that these people, the conservationists, had also sold our air. And I found it very interesting, because when we are going to get to the part on carbon credits, you will see how this commodification of nature, so the transformation of everything nature is, it could be air, land, water, is part of this colonial project that has been going around for a long time, and that it's also embedded into conservation practices. So let's talk about colonization, because if we want to decolonize conservation, first we have to understand why conservation today is colonial. I think most of us, and especially you students, have a very clear idea, your generation have a very clear idea of what colonialism is. And we have in mind images that are, for us, embedded colonialism. And this is one of the images. So we probably see this image, and we can certainly say this happened during colonial times. We can see the hats, we can see the behavior of, you won't recognize the person who was in the other picture, and then he's now also in this picture. Maybe he's Theodore Roosevelt. He was the president of the United States, and he did a trip at one point when he was not president anymore, in the beginning of the 20th century, to Africa. He was considered one of the biggest conservationists in American history. During his presidency, he created an enormous amount of national parks, and was among the people that travel into this expedition. You can see him here, to collect animals and plants in Africa and bring them to the United States. The idea was that knowledge will protect nature. He killed during that expedition 11,000 different kinds of animals to bring them to the States. He was a hunter, but he's also considered thing that it's completely normal, as I will explain you, one of the best American conservationists. We can see by this picture how colonial his attitude was. And it's clear for us that this is a kind of colonialism. We can see the local people, African people, that are bringing his staff, where he was taking pictures and visiting different national parks. The problem for us is that so our idea of colonialism is so clear and is linked to a certain date, that it's more difficult to recognize what colonialism is after and how it reproduced in the time. We have, for example, I show you this image, and you probably won't recognize anything colonialist in this image. Barack Obama was also a United States president. Also, he actually created more parks than Roosevelt. And he gave the voice to do this very interesting documentary in Netflix that I also invite you to watch, about all great national parks. He's talked about all great national parks, but he doesn't talk only about national parks in the United States. He talked about national parks in different parts of the world. We see this image and we think there's nothing actually, as I said, colonialist about this. And what about this image? So this is another image that I took from a Frankfurt Zoological Society. It's a German NGO this is from their annual report, and it's a picture of the Serengeti. It's a national park in the North Tanzania. And what about this image? Another image coming from WWF website. This is the Congo Basin according to the WWF. For us, these images are just simply pictures of nature, right? Or what about this one? This is the Lion King Disney movie. It's just a children movie, right? So I will invite you to remember the images I show you, because I will try to explain you how much colonialism is embedded and racism too in images like this. When I went to Tanzania the first time, I also went to Serengeti, and I also went to Ngorongoro and Loliondo, that are areas around the Serengeti. I took this picture myself because I was completely shocked about what I was seeing. Instead of seeing the zebras, right, with the buffaloes in these big plains in the Serengeti, what I was seeing mostly around the Serengeti was the zebras that were coexisting with cows and Maasai villages. This is the image we will see everywhere if it was not for colonialism. This is the real nature for the people that are not visiting national parks as tourists. The problem is that in order to create the other images I show you, in order to give birth to that kind of nature without humans, without domesticated animals, indigenous people have to pay a very huge price. I will show you what happened, a short video. I will comment after. This is a video that was sent to me, and it was also circulating in internet from our Maasai contact just near this place. The Maasai were evicted violently in June 2022 again from Loliondo, one of their areas where they used to live, in order to recreate an image like this. They were evicted already. This is the Serengeti is a national park in Tanzania, as I explained you, where the Maasai were living until 1959, when the British colonizers decided the park has to be empty of people. And so they were evicted. They moved to other areas next to the park, like the one I took the picture, and now they are also being evicted from those areas. The idea is that tourists that come to see wild nature don't want to see the cows of the Maasai, because the idea they have in their minds is that image that I showed you before, is that we are going to go to Africa to do a safari, and then they call Tanzania Africa for some reason, we could generalize a lot of countries in one, but the idea is that they are going to see wild nature and no people. And that's why the Maasai are being evicted today. This is partially what we call green colonialism, which is basically the same of colonialism. I'm going to explain and develop this concept, but it's land theft, but it's done in the name of nature protection, so it's considered green. The first concept that is at the base of green colonialism is the idea of wilderness. The idea of wilderness, it's a concept that was born in the United States and imply that nature is something that is empty and is wild, and only animals and plants live there. There is no human being that is living in those areas or using those areas. As Luther Standing Bear, which he was a Lakota leader from the United States, put it, that nature was empty, was wilderness only for the white men that couldn't see that actually those were not empty spaces. Wilderness is the founder concept of conservation as we know it today. The conservation movement was born in the United States at the end of the 19th century. The first national parks in the United States were created at the end of the 19th century with the idea that it was necessary to protect the wilderness around, the beauty of, for example, Yosemite or Yellowstone, that you might know as the first national parks in the United States, and also still today are very visited by thousands and hundreds of tourists every year. Those areas were not, of course, wilderness. There were people living there. There were indigenous peoples living there that took care of those environments for generations. But the people that created the national parks and decided to protect this wilderness were mostly white settlers. The reason why I'm telling you that they were white settlers is because the entire idea of nature as something aesthetic, far away from us to protect, is of course very different from the idea of nature that someone who works the land or who lived in the land has. We are at the end of the 19th century, so other things that were happening in the States and in Europe was, of course, the second industrial revolution. The more we were destroying nature in our own countries, the more we were dreaming of this untouched nature that we could go and see. But at the same time, we don't have to forget that the end of the 19th century are the years of the development of the social theories from Darwin theory that imply there were different categories of human beings in the world and societies. So they were the ones who were practicing the Industrial Revolution, Europeans and white Americans that were they were the most considered the most evolved kind of society, and then there were the others that were considered primitive. The idea of wilderness is linked into all of this, is linked into the destruction of the Industrial Revolution, in the dreaming of nature that we were destroying, and into the idea that other ways of living were primitive and or were necessary to be eliminated or educated to become like us. Is this idea of national park that was created in the United States as something, as a sanctuary of nature, of wild nature, that is then used by Europeans when in the same years we are at the expansion of the colonial empires in Africa. So we are in a moment where Europeans are dividing Africa among themselves. You might remember the Berlin Conference. And the idea was to of course, take the resources of Africa that were necessary for nourishing the second industrial revolution, of course, but also at the same time, this contradiction that I was telling you, the more we destroy nature, the more we need to dream of places where we can just go and see nature. So that was this kind of a schizophrenic behavior. It was clearly what was happening in the colonies. On one side, Europeans were taking all the resources they could to nourish the Industrial Revolution. On the other hand, they were trying to protect pieces of nature. The thing that is very curious about this schizophrenic behavior is that because of the racism that Europeans had, instead of realizing that the nature that they wanted so much to protect was being destroyed by themselves, they start blaming indigenous peoples and local communities. Europeans, especially in India, as you can see, but also, so it was not just British in the British Empire, also in the German and the French and the Belgian one, usually love hunting. So they create the first national parks as game reserves. The idea was we can hunt animals because we do it in a rational way. For us, it's a sport, as Teddy Roosevelt put it. we are moral people because we hunt for sport and we do it rationally, while the indigenous peoples there are, and local people are hunting to feed their families. That was considered poaching, that was considered illegal, was considered something that was irrational. They are almost like animals. That's how they were described. So they start putting into place many what is called forest codes, so laws to ban local people from living and practicing hunting or agriculture in their own lands. And as I say, the idea was to control the space and divide it in a rational way. The idea that science was something very that make us superior was also typical of the social theories that developed after Darwin. And so Europeans thought they could manage this environment better than the people. So they will exploit certain areas, take the resource, and in other areas they will just protect them through national parks or game reserves. The first national park of Africa was actually created in the Congo and DRC, that was, of course, under today's DRC, of course, at that time was under Belgium rule, a terrifying, as you might know, empire that killed almost half of the population, asking them to extract rubber from the trees. It was a genocide that is called as the Red Rubber genocide. And at the same time, that's where the first national park was created. Today it's called Virunga National Park. It was called at that time Parc Albert, Albert, like the emperor. And that park was a park created in order to, it was not for hunting, different from other that were called game reserves. It was created so Europeans could still see gorillas and animals, despite all the destruction that they were producing around. This is the story of the national park. So as I told you, every national park was created at the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, was created by evicting the indigenous peoples that were living there, including Yosemite and Yellowstone, including glaciers in the United States. The same thing is valid for every park in Africa was created in this time. There were people living in those areas. They were not empty, and they were banned and accused of destroying nature, what Europeans could hunt in the same territories. I put a picture of a tiger hunt, which was a very common sport among British elites and the Raj elite too in the Indian Empire. And according to many data, this is partially the reduction of the number of tigers was very impressive in the British Empire, and it was due mostly to hunting from white people or Indian elites. But the reason why I tell you this story is not, I'm not a historian, and it's not, we're not going to talk about only the past, is to explain you how those practices so embedded in conservation. That's how conservation was born. Conservation was born in this way, was created by white men that were trying to protect the dream of wilderness against the people that were protecting this environment, without criticizing at all the colonial or the industrial revolution that was actually destroying those areas. That kind of conservationist dream is still alive, and this is why it's so important to know the history. We can see racism in conservationist practices today, and I really invite you, now that I am trying to give you some tools to reflect on languages and images, to go and to read the websites of conservation organizations or their annual reports, or just the press, how different they talk about Europeans going to Africa to hunt, for example, and how different they talk about the people that actually hunt there to feed their families. I usually like it's an old article, but I put this image of that was published in 2014 in CNN. and the page of the CNN, because I find it one of the most clear examples of how racism is portrayed in a such almost innocent way. So this woman here, Lila Hassa, got a prize. She was nominated CNN Hero because, this is what the CNN said, she was transforming lion killers into lion guardians. The lion killers are the Maasai, which are people living in Kenya and Tanzania. Pastoralists have been living there for generations and are the custodians, the guardians of the places where you can find more lions. There is more concentration of lions in many of the places where the Maasai are living than anyone else. So if they were lion killers, why there are so many lions in Maasai land? It's true that the Maasai used to perform rituals where they used to kill lions. They don't do that anymore. And also sometimes they have to kill the lions to defend their livestock, but they are not lion killers. All of this is very codified in their way of life, and they have been they do it in very precise times. They don't do it for sport, and none of this has actually had any impact on lion population. The fact that a woman she studied in the United States, can go to explain to the Maasai how to protect their own environment is pure racism. There's no other way to put it. Usually you will see in the press that every time that an African person kills an animal, he's considered a poacher. While we call people that pay money to hunt hunters. The difference between poachers and hunters is just sometimes the color of their skin. And the fact that one pay to do it and the other ones or don't have any choice, or they have to do, or they do it to feed their families. The hunter that you can see here is Peter Fletch. He was a trustee of WWF South Africa. And he went to Cameroon, his picture is in Cameroon, to kill an animal where you probably paying thousands of euros. It can cost until $45,000 to kill an animal. While the people living in the forest, these are park rangers, but in this forest there are people living, the Baka, can risk their lives and die in the hands of these park rangers to hunt an elephant or any other animal to feed their families. In the name of conservation, what we have today is a total militarization of former indigenous territories. Indigenous peoples were and are the best guardians of the natural world, so they manage so well their own territories that have so much biodiversity. They are the most they are the guardians of the most biodiverse places in the world. And there must be a reason. This is very difficult for people that are, as I said, have these racist biases to understand. But nature is not a wild place. Nature is what we call nature, are spaces, ecosystems that were created by the interaction between humans, indigenous peoples, and their environment around. They do things to create the biodiversity richness. They are not just living the spaces. Their way of life, the way that they work, is based on sustainability. They need to create interactions with the ecosystem in a way that also the children will have things to eat and medicinal plants to heal themselves. The reciprocity is a very important concept in most indigenous cultures. They take from nature, but they give back. The Baka, for example, used to collect what is called wild yam. And it's wild, of course, so they don't plant it, but they collect it and they never take it away the root. So there will be more of these wild yams in the future, but they also spread like pieces of this wild yam in the forest in order to create vegetable, like a kind of mosaic of this plant. This vegetable is not considered vegetable, but it's a root. This root is very loved by elephants. So usually they create an ecosystem where there are a lot of elephants. The Baka, which are living in Congo and Cameroon, also kill the elephants sometimes for rituals. But it is at the same time they have many taboos and prohibitions of which kind of elephant they can hunt. They never overhunt. They do it in a way that is we can have also conversation about for what it means for elephant rights, but from a cultural perspective and a natural perspective, they have done it in a way that is respectful of the environment without never putting in danger the elephant's population. All of this is considered, and all of this rich knowledge, imagine the knowledge you have to have about an environment in order to protect it so well. They know, indigenous peoples usually know every root, every rock, every kind of plant. They know how to use it for themselves, but they know also how they reproduce, how important it is to maintain certain rules around how to use it. All of this was considered in the colonial time superstition. The only knowledge that was legitimate was science or Western science at that time. This continued the day of today. The majority of national parks keep being based on the idea that people have to be left out, not all the people, and this is where we see the racism, because Europeans or white people can pay to go inside the national park in Africa, for example, Virunga or whatever other park. They can pay and they can see the animals, while the people that don't have money, they can't access their own land. And in order to control that this is happening in this way, many conservation NGOs that today manage those parks put into place park guards, as the one you see in this picture. So we pass from colonial times, where the colonial empires created the park, to a world where the parks are handled by conservation organizations that are based in the same countries that were the colonial powers before. African states and Asia states, especially also the two continents, don't have a lot of money to manage the parks, or they don't receive the money. We are going to see why. So there is a kind of privatization of conservation. It's conservation. These parks are managed usually by conservation NGOs based in Europe or the United States. They sometimes co-manage it with the African states, but the protected areas wouldn't work without the money of Europeans and Americans and the NGOs that manage these parks. So here we see these park rangers, and the park rangers are being told none of the local people can get in the park. Inside the park, many activities are banned, despite they are sustainable for the environment. As I said, tourism and scientific research is allowed. So what we see is that these park rangers ended up committing a lot of atrocities. They shoot to kill people that are suspect of being poachers, when sometimes they just go in the park to collect medicinal plants or to hunt to feed their families. They're put in prison, they're being tortured, women are being raped. Scandals of this kind are unfortunately not an isolated case, but they go on and go on and go on. I have been collecting testimonies, hundreds of testimonies of human rights violations by park rangers in many parts, as I said, both in the African continent and Asian continent. I put a short video of a Baka woman. The Baka, as I said, are hunter-gatherers that live in the North Congo and in the South Cameroon. They have been, since time immemorial, living in those forests, and they are now being evicted by different projects of WWF that create this kind of parks. I put her testimony so you can hear firsthand what it means for the people, the presence of park rangers in their land. I don't know what the video is. Okay, it's here.
Boy, wa bulukene finga goma bele wa boa bo ma duma kwa titi agba bo ko tie ke wa bulukete mo ko me ma go wa bele pe ma jota ka ko mo mà chôn chôn nó cũng cái hoa bùn kia cái mà đi à gốc cái mà tôi mà gom mong cái hoa bò lấy bò để đủ cái city cái này cái nó hoa mèo tu pele amele commande que qua le me be qua no pondo le gbe qua ka me be no pondo commande ma joko o ma amele pa za mi kona denda lipolo ngagwa amango makina pe pele ango ko baja ma me pe po bitige ma so pa peke ma titi angba peke ke mboni ma so ko ni ma dutu nango pele ko uja.
So her name is Paulette, and she's explaining, she's a Baka woman. I myself took that video. She is a woman who is explaining very clear what means that all of a sudden their land is turned into a national park and the entire way of life is banned and criminalized. They can't even collect mangoes. These are the Baka. I put you a couple of pictures. That are a threat, apparently, for WWF. These are eating honey that they collect themselves from the trees. We arrived at this point in nature conservation where, as I said, even today, conservation NGOs are blaming indigenous peoples for the destruction of the environment that they didn't cause. But as I was trying to explain to you before, this is happening with our money. Around 80% of all the funds going to conservation globally end up in the hands of the same 5 NGOs, in particularly WWF, WCS, and Conservation International. There's also the Nature Conservancy, African Parks, and other big conservation organizations. The money that goes to conservation in the world, it also comes from, of course, those countries who were able to make that money by extracting resources from others. And as a Maasai man told me one time, I put this sentence because he is very, for me, it's very powerful. Your money is poison to us. He's talking about the money that we give for conservation, but he's also talking about the money we spend going as tourists in those areas where they have been evicted. If we look at this is it's an old figure. It's from 2016, but it's I find the graphic very good. The figure, the money is still like the repartition of who gives what. It's almost still the same, but we are talking about more money today. So I decided to use it anyway. We can see that the biggest funders. This is against what it's called. So this is money going to fight illegal wildlife trade. It's coming from Germany as single country, USA, European Commission, France, UK, and then we have the big institutions like the GAF, which is part of it's a fund, an environmental fund, part of the UN. Then we have the UNDP, and when we see where the money goes, so when we are giving money as countries to fight poaching, it actually goes to law enforcement and protected areas management. But what happened with this money is that we are using it to fight people that is hunting to feed their families. Nobody is putting into question that illegal poaching is, of course, a big problem. There are, of course, illegal networks of that are poaching animals for selling their parts, and this is a big problem. But it's also shown by different studies that the way to combat this kind of illegal trade is to tackle the consumer behavior. So the people that are actually paying to use, I don't know, ivory, for example. And those are nothing to do with the local people that are living there in those areas and are hunting to feed their family. We also know that many of the illegal wildlife trade is handled by corrupted officers. So again, nothing to do with the people that are living there, and they are paying the price for something they haven't done. In the meanwhile, in a protected area, so-called protected area, so could be national parks or tiger reserves, this is what we see. We see mass tourism. In the Ngorongoro conservation area, where the Maasai live, I show you before the Serengeti, so it's just next to Serengeti. The Maasai are today threatened with eviction. The government has cut all access to social services, schools, and doctors. They are being criminalized. And at the same time, there are 250 vehicles that visit the crater of Ngorongoro every day. 250 vehicles a day. It's also proved by science that mass tourism can have a huge impact on those natural spaces. Just think about even the journey of an American tourist that go to Tanzania or India to see a tiger or a lion or whatever they go to see. Taking the plane, to think about the climate impact that all of this had. And then they stay in hotels that are inside these protected areas, because hotels are allowed to stay, but not the huts of indigenous people. Hotels that consume and pollute, and then the jeeps that create noise and, of course, produce emissions. Sometimes they hit animals. The tourists want the more and more be closer to the animals, so they use alternative roads instead of going to the ones that exist already, creating a huge impact. All of this is allowed inside protected areas, just as in colonial times. What we see is that we know there has just been a study published yesterday about how protected areas fail to protect biodiversity. And we know for sure, because we also have the science, that indigenous territories, so when indigenous peoples are in control of their land, they succeed to protect biodiversity, and there is less deforestation. So why we keep pushing for the wrong model? And I think that these images are quite interesting, because for me, it shows the link that has always existed between the capital, the big capital, and the conservation NGOs. The entire model of conservation is based on the idea that it's okay to destroy if we keep aside some pieces of land, of wild nature, for us to go to see it. It was like this. I explained you in the United States, there was, and in the first national parks, the idea was the Industrial Revolution is destroying nature, but the Industrial Revolution is the maximum expression of civilization, and we want to stop it. So what we have to stop is that there is destruction in certain areas. So we can go as tourists to see it and take pictures. This is exactly the same model that the colonizers applied, and it's exactly the same model that is today in the conservation world. We can see very clear in certain areas of Congo how the territory was divided between logging concessions, so places where it's okay to deforestate and just cut down the entire tree, and protected areas. And these two are not opposite, are part of the same system. WWF will consider a threat to the forest a Baka person who goes inside the forest to collect wood to set fire in his own hut, but will partner with logging concessions while tearing apart the forest. When we see the corporate links that they exist inside each of, I put the two biggest, WCS and WWF, it's actually impressive. And actually, a study that was I published, I think, last year, showed how half of the governance bodies of these big conservation organizations are in the hands of big finance firms. What we see, for example, of WWF is that recently, so until I think it was July last year or this year, the CEO, or the ex-CEO of Coca-Cola was the president of WWF. And before that, if you go to the WWF website and you see the list of the presidents, you are going to see the ex-CEO of Shell, you're going to see kings, you're going to see very powerful and important men, mostly linked to the big capital. It's the same for WCS, so I'm just giving an example. So we have people that were formerly working in Texaco and Unilever. So this is just to show you that this conservation model was not born to protect nature against the big roots of the problem. Was not done to protect nature against big companies, multinational corporations, that are the cause of the destruction, of course, it's being done in a way that the economical system can keep going on. We keep destroying, the destruction of the planet is not put into cost, but we save spaces for us to enjoy nature in an aesthetical way. And at the end of all of this, it comes the new threat for indigenous peoples, which is new in the sense that it's a new name that we are going to put, which are carbon credits, but also biodiversity credits. Keep an eye on the COP16 that is coming in 1 month at the end of October, the COP16 on biodiversity, because there will be a big push on biodiversity credits, which is, I'm not going to talk about that today because I don't have time. It's another big concept that comes, is very similar to carbon credits, so biodiversity, climate compensation, offsetting. But this is causing a big assault on indigenous people's land. It's a new division of, especially in Africa, we see, it's a new division of African resources, this time in the name, as I said, of climate mitigation. And also we will see biodiversity offsetting. I guess you are familiar with the concept of carbon credits, but it's very linked today with conservation, because the idea of carbon credit is, I am a company, I pollute, I release X amount of carbon, tons of carbon in the atmosphere. I can, instead of reducing it to meet my climate target, I can just simply buy carbon credits in the market. These carbon credits are produced by projects that or protect a certain amount of carbon, so avoid that they are released in the atmosphere, or that absorb a certain amount of carbon. So the same amount that is avoided or released can serve to compensate certain quantities of emissions of companies. It's a very problematic concept because that's not how in reality works. I'm going to explain you a little bit more, but that is also a way to fund protected areas, because conservationists tell us today, thanks to our protected areas, we don't have deforestation in those areas, for example, so we avoid the release of X amount of carbon. So we, WWF or WCS, can sell from those protected areas where indigenous people were evicted, carbon credits that will help in the other side of the world, a multimillionaire company to keep polluting the planet, saying that they met their climate targets. It seems a crazy model, and it seems that only Shell would be interested in pushing this, but it's not the case. Also, WWF, WCS, and all the other conservationist organizations have been pushing for these things that they call nature-based solutions. With that, they rebranded the name of carbon offsetting, so it sounds less threatening. So they're pushing for it. There are many problems with it. I told you, one way to supposedly do carbon sequestration is by planting trees. So no protected areas, planting trees. Usually these trees are monocultures, that destroy the biodiversity of a place. They are set fire very, very easily. So all the carbon they supposedly sequestrate when it goes again in the atmosphere, or they're simply planted to then being cut and used for industrial purposes. But at the same time, they're also used to sell carbon credits. So it just doesn't really actually make any impact or have any effect on the climate. But it helps to supposedly compensate emissions. The reason why I'm talking to you about this is not, I'm not going to talk only about the climate impact, is that many of these plantations, tree plantations, are done where, of course, they're not happening in Italy or in France, are being done in places that are considered, again, empty. But this case, for example, which it was reported by the Auckland Institute, it was done, these tree plantations were done in Uganda, in a territory that was a farmer land, and caused the evictions of, I think, many farmers. That is, they were not able to keep farming their lands in order to compensate the emissions of some millionaire multinational company. I documentate myself another kind, which is in the second type, so not the ones who, not those projects which are trying to sequestrate more carbon through tree plantations, but those projects that avoid deforestation, like protected areas. We know that all these projects, I'm not going to come back again with the concept, 94% of many forest carbon offsetting projects were actually proven by independent research to be just completely a scam, in the sense that they're not compensating absolutely anything. There are also very technical reasons for which carbon compensation is absolutely difficult to do. I'm not going to go in detail here. If you want more, you can email me. But despite this is the way the world is going, and we are having the more and more indigenous peoples reaching out to us and saying, carbon credit projects are coming to our lands, and we are very worried. And they should, because we are seeing what's happening. I just going to give you this last example because I think it's very concrete, and for me it shows, before, as I said, I would like that we have at least half an hour for questions. I think I have collected this case by myself and my colleagues in Kenya, and I think it shows all the problems that we have been talking until now with conservation, from racism to colonialism and commodification of nature. We publish a report that is very technical if you're interested in carbon credits dynamics, that is called Blood Carbon. That's the name of our campaign too. So you can see that in our website, but I'm just going to explain you a little bit how it works, because it's actually, as I said, very representative of everything that's wrong with conservation. So we have an organization, conservation organization called NRT, Northern Rangeland Trust, that was created by this man, Ian Craig. Ian Craig comes from a British colonizer family that they set up in the north of Kenya when the British Crown was giving good land to their good citizens. And his family thrived for a long time having a ranch, right, with cows. At one point, when it became difficult to sell meat, his family had an idea: why we don't transform the ranch into what is called a conservancy. That means a place that tourists can pay to see animals. So they transformed the ranch into first a rhino conservancy. Now there are all sorts of animals. So basically, it's a private land. It's a private zoo. It's a private land where you can go to see the zoo. He then thought that was such a great idea, Ian Craig thought that was such a great idea that he could also convince the pastoralists, people that live in Kenya, North Kenya, Samburu, Borana, that have been grazing cows and other animals, not only cows, we have sheep and camels for generations. They could convince them to do the same, to set aside some part of their land and let wildlife thrive, wild animals. So tourists then will pay to see the wild animals. And he created this organization. For this great idea that he had, he was honored a lot of prizes. Prince William, for example, he's a very friend of the royal family, gave him a prize. The problem is that the pastoralists that have been living in those areas for generations, many of, not all of them, of course, many were happy with his idea. Many were not happy with his idea, because that means that the land that is available to graze will be reduced. We are in an area, just to explain you, very, very dry, where we have rain patterns that change. So we have a season where it rains a lot, and then a season where it doesn't rain. What actually allows the pastoralists to live for so long time, generations in this area, is the fact that they move. They move with their cows, searching places where it's raining or where there is more grass. Well, if they set aside and create these protected areas only for animals, the conservancies, they can't graze anymore. They don't have the same space. There are many other areas that, like Ian Craig, are private land. So there's thousands of land that was given by the crown to colonizers, and usually at the best land. So there's not a lot of land available. So many people say, we don't want this. But this was not a reply that NRT could hear. They, in many cases, imposed, in other cases, co-opted leaders and other people to create these conservancy protected areas that are, again, protected by park rangers. So if you graze in the wrong place, you can get hit and killed and die or imprisoned. This picture is from a protest that people held against NRT because they didn't want them in their lands. But the madness arrives. So we have a model of conservation that is completely colonialist. It's imposed on the people, in many cases, or co-opted. We have a white guy who thinks he has a great idea to handle the problems of the entire North Kenya, which is an area that is it's big, it's enormous. And he thought an organization that received funds from Europe and the United States could manage that land. We have the idea that we need to keep the spaces empty from people to see wild animals. We have all of this, and then we arrived at the end of the story, where on top of that, the NRT decided to develop a carbon project in these areas, based it again on a completely colonialist idea. So this is we took it from their document, so it's not that I made it up. I couldn't have done it so well. They said that indigenous pastoralists who have been doing grazing their cows and their animals for generations in the area are grazing in a way that is completely rational. There's no rest, no recovery. They are ruining the soil. That's what they're saying. They just go with their cows in whatever place. You can see the cows here, and there's no time for the grass to recovery. But thanks to NRT that put aside pieces of land, then they will teach them how to do grazing. So the pastoralists will all of a sudden, thanks to Ian Craig, who had a ranch, understand how to do rotational grazing. And then they will graze in the right way. You can see the arrows. And then the grass will grow, and that grass will absorb carbon credit. And then NRT will be able to sell that carbon credit to polluting companies. It seems absolutely absurd and crazy that an NGO is teaching pastoralists how to graze. They have been doing this for generations. But unfortunately, this was approved and sold. The carbon credits were certified by Verra, which is the biggest certifier, and bought by different companies all around the world. Companies that you might recognize, as you can see here, Meta, Netflix, Kering, and recently British Airways. So think about a model, and I always get upset when I arrive this part, because for me it's just so absurd that this exists, where we have a country, or especially an area of the world, North Kenya, that is severely hit by climate change. Climate change is having a huge impact on the life of the pastoralist, because without rain, there is no grass, and without grass, the cows can't eat. The cows are everything for the pastoralist. This concept is very important. We are talking about the land. The land has the indigenous people have a strong connection with their land. They depend 100% of the land to live. Without the cows, the pastoralists Samburu, Maasai, Rendile, Borana, Turkana, they can't live. They use the cows to, of course, take the milk and eat, to exchange them for other things. They need the cows to get married, to build their houses. The cows are wealth for pastoralists. Without climate change having a huge impact on their way of life. But on top of that, the supposed solution to climate change is to stop them grazing. So they're paying the price for a climate crisis they didn't cause, for a solution for something they didn't cause. And on top of that, because this project is completely fake, there's no way that the reason why there is no grass, there's no reason, it's no link to pastoralists. And because this is fake, these carbon credits don't don't serve the purpose. And British Airways is actually keep polluting the planet and causing more climate change while telling to their customers that they're compensating their emissions. So this is the model of conservation we are having today. Of course, this is why I invite you to always look into these solutions like the biodiversity credit. You will hear a lot about it. The same idea, you can destroy biodiversity in a place if you compensate in another place. All of this is going to solve by the finance. It's based on the idea that some people control the land and some others have to give up their resources for it. There is no such a thing as empty land where we are going to be able to do our carbon offsetting project without having an impact on the people that are living there. And it doesn't take into consideration the root of the problem. To tackle climate crisis, as well as to tackle the biodiversity loss crisis, we need to look at the root of the problem, which is not how to allow these companies to keep polluting, but how can we live in a world in a sustainable way ourselves, and what we need to do, how we have to change our economy to do so. 80% of world biodiversity is on indigenous lands. We have proved that they manage their environment better than anyone else. And this is because they have a special relationship with nature. And they are not, the models of the way of living and their culture are not based on eternal growth and exploiting nature for profit, as our way of lives are based on our economy system. We need to recognize their territorial rights. We need to acknowledge that they know what they're doing, decolonize our practice, stop being thinking in such racist ways as the conservation organizations are thinking. Let them handle their own land. Of course, that not everything that is required to be done to protect nature, because as I said, the root of the problems is in our societies, the way we consume and produce resources. So that's required, of course, to be tackled, but it's recognizing indigenous people's rights is, of course, an important step into this direction. This image, as I told you, is not actually neutral. It's not actually scientific. It's not just a picture. It's part of transmission of a colonial idea of what nature is. This is a real image of how the Congo Basin looked like when you are actually there. There are people, there are plantations also, for example, cacao, and also other species that are not considered wild. This is why we need to decolonize conservation, and we need to join the fight for indigenous people's rights. That's what we do in survival. We do it supporting indigenous peoples. We can see them here in India, that they're having a protest against evictions from tiger reserve, but we can do it here because the money, as I said, comes from here, not just the money. We set up the agendas, and from an international level, the environmental agendas. The NGOs that are pushing for these ideas are based in our own countries, and so there is much to do in our countries too. I just put at the end, take an action. We are now doing this action against what we call blood carbon projects, are offsetting projects that are happening in protected areas, and they have a huge impact on indigenous people's lives. So I invite you to take action and send an urgent message. There are many other things in our website if you want to visit, but I always like to end up with a take an action call. And I think we have time, half an hour for questions.
Thank you.
Thanks, Fiore, for your contribution. I think it is a good excursus from one side with some theoretical reflection, from the other side, it's a very practical example. Now we open the space for question. Please, the floor is yours to make questions.
Okay, do we have any questions? Okay.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. It was really interesting, and I have a few questions. First of all, it's if you know approximately when AIN-RT was founded and if it's still active. Also, I was asking like all the protected areas that they don't allow any anthropogenical activities, but they instead allow tourism activities. Who regulates these areas, I guess, is the local governments. They have to accept the money givers. I'm sorry for my English, I'm not finding the good words, but I guess that when they accept the money, they have also to accept the conditions, and so they have to accept all the tourism activities. And the last one is I'm really interested in environmental international cooperation, but every time I find some good projects, like some years later or some months later, I see that they're not taking, well, indigenous practices or local people perspective. For example, so if you have any example of any good, good licit project or associations or any good and hopeful project that I could look into. Because, for example, these last years, I've been listening a lot about ethnoscience, ethnobiology, ethnobotanic, saying that it is important to listen indigenous people knowledge, but instead they again make it in an academic knowledge. It was actually a university subject, so they make the academia knowledge again. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your questions. The first question was about ENATE. ENATE was created in 2004, so quite recently. It's part of a new push of the conservation industry for what they call community conservancies. So the idea was that it's very difficult to actually they change continuously the language in order after criticism. So when people start criticizing them for their neocolonial practices, they start using community conservation as a branding. It's like sustainable development, and they change wording so it sounds better. But so ENATE was part of this new wording. So the idea was that they were creating community conservancies. And it still exists today, but Ian Craig, the white man I show you receiving the prize from Prince William, he quit recently, I think last month or a couple of months ago, actually because of the lack of transparency of the organization and also of the racism of the organization. So he himself quit the organization that he funded. Despite this, they keep selling carbon credits, and many companies keep buying them. So it's just quite scandalous. So that's for the first question. The second, protected areas are, of course, regulated by the states, but usually they have to, in order to receive international funding, to respect what they're called the IUCN categories. IUCN is International Union for Conservation of Nature. So there are categories, 1 very restricted, 2 until 6. And so these categories explain and say how much activity you can do inside. So in 1, you can do any activity except tourism. In another one, you can do some activity. So it's all regulated by the international. The agenda is set up, as I explained, and the rules are set up by the international, the UN or I don't know, the European Commission. Of course, each state then has their own rules. But as I said, the money comes from outside. So if you want to know which the rules respect, you have to do it following the funders' guidelines. That said, many African states want these protected areas to develop tourism because that means that a lot of money arrives. This is the case of the Maasai, the Tanzania state. They are evicting the Maasai so they can develop tourism inside these areas, and not just European tourism or American tourism, but there is a lot of hunting, trophy hunting tourism that comes especially now from the Emirates. In Loliondo, it was clear the Maasai were evicted because there was a company from the Dubai royal family that wanted to do trophy hunting there. And as I said, the tourists don't want to see the Maasai. When I talked with a guy from a hotel in Loliondo, and he told me the tourists complain when they see cows, especially Europeans. They complain, they want to see they want just to see wilderness. So it's true that the African states have, of course, a lot of responsibility, but it's also true that the idea that the Maasai shouldn't be there is not only Tanzanian government responsibility. That's just to say. And about good projects, I really wish they were at my so of course I'm sure they are around there, but because of the nature of my job that consists in going around the world, trying to understand, trying to collect evidence of human rights violations, I am usually facing people that have been victims of human rights violations in projects that were wrongly done. So it's difficult for me to give you a positive example. What I can say is I haven't been in one single national park in the ones I visit in Africa and Asia that were respecting indigenous people's rights. And I don't believe that anything that these big conservation organizations are managing can be done that well. You can't be completely violating indigenous people's rights in a park in Congo and then trying to do a good thing somewhere else. The way these organizations work is not like that. So for me, that's the case. Then there are a lot of very good projects. There are a lot of very good people are doing all around the world, but it's very difficult for those people to get funding because, as I said, and as I have been told one time in Washington, D.C., WWF know how to write projects. They know how to ask the funding. They have the political power. You think about lobbying, like they are the organization that had spent more money in lobbying in Brussels. They know how to get the funds. So it's very difficult to find good projects, not because they are not good people with very good ideas. It's just because it's very difficult for them to get the money. I hope that replied to your question.
Thanks. We have another question. Yes.
Okay. Hello, Fiore. Thank you for the talk. I think the problem statement was very clear to me. I would like to ask on, because for me, the time on possible solutions or ways to act came a bit short. And since, like, for example, I come from Europe, so I see more that my way of action is in Europe. And as you also pointed out, for me, the root cause is more that people in industrialized areas or where industrial revolution came from have lost the idea that like humans should coexist with nature. So as you pointed out, okay, we only need protected areas in places that we are not because we destroyed everything here. So do you have maybe ideas on how to, maybe you could say, reconstitute the consciousness or the connection to nature that people have that are now traveling to parks, like you mentioned, Serengeti National Parks, and then are disappointed that they see people are actually also living there. So, because for me, it also seems problematic to now have an initiative joined by white people. I mean, you and I are white people right now as well, that acts then in exactly those places where we say, actually, we should leave those people alone and live their life. Like, why do we try to, again, act into their lives? I hope the question was clear.
Yeah, it was very clear. Yeah, that's exactly what survival doesn't do. So we don't do projects. So our entire in indigenous land, our entire work consists in lobbying the German government, for example, or the French government, the American government, to stop funding the wrong conservation projects. And we are working mostly with the public opinion here in the West, because we think that is where the money is coming. So we are trying to educate them, explaining them that what we are doing is wrong. We have stopped a lot of funding going to the wrong projects, and we are putting pressure on governments to instead put human rights concept inside it. You can't do a biodiversity project protection without human rights, taking into account indigenous people's rights, working with the governments of the other countries to recognize indigenous people's land rights. So that's mostly what we are doing. We are also helping indigenous peoples to come to Europe. For example, that now we have Maasai delegation visiting in Paris. that they can go directly to the European Parliament or the German government, which is unfortunately funding much more of the crimes against the Maasai, to explain them their situation. So we put a lot of pressure, and we also ask all supporters and people that join us to send emails or to take action against this. So we are trying, as I said, our project is very decolonial. We are not trying to do anything in their land. We are trying to get us to stop doing the wrong thing. I do truly believe that in the moment that there is accountability too, because the big conservation organizations and the governments are violating the rights of people, and there's no accountability. So we want that accountability. We want that they pay for what they have done, that they apologize, that they compensate indigenous people for what they have done, or whatever else indigenous people tell us that they would like to receive from these organizations. But we also, I truly believe that there is the idea that we are not here to give a universal solution. I don't have, as I always said, the magic power to say, oh, well, I know how to solve all the problems of the world. What the decolonial approach teaches us is that first we have to look into us and what we are doing and try to change the things. And indigenous peoples can teach us a lot and about how to deal differently with nature. I think that what survival also tries to do, as other than the lobbying and the advocacy, is to educate people at the value of diversity, to listen to indigenous people. We produce, we ask them to send us videos, and we then edit them in which they explain their way of life. We give them a platform to speak to the world, because I think there is a big job to do before even having so-called solutions, is to listen to what the other people are facing and how different they deal with the idea of nature. I think that it would be very important for us. But there is, I don't think there is one single solution that we have to do something is going to change. I think that actually having the idea that there is one solution that is going to be perfect and helpful for all is part of this colonial thinking, that we are the ones going to find the solution. Solutions are out there, different ways of seeing the world are out there, but we just don't listen. We are just so focused on on ourselves that we can't listen. So I think that there are these two things for us that we can do as survival, the organization I represent. That one is to hold all governments and NGOs accountable of what they're doing. We help them and we help functionaries to understand what they're doing wrong, to stop projects that can be terrible for indigenous people. So we do our part in our own countries. And then the other part is to help them, to give them a platform to speak to the different audiences and explain what is going on in their lands, but also explaining how different things can be.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question, maybe two. Let's see.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Roberto from Mexico. Mine is, I think, specific. I just wanted to know your perspective about the nature-based solutions. You talked about the carbon credits and biodiversity credits, and I also do not like that idea of paying to pollute. But I have heard the term to refer to this kind of ways that green or blue infrastructure can be used also in urban settings, like to handle all of the negative externalities of the human and industrial activity. So I just wanted to know, how would you define the nature-based solutions approach? And if you find something positive about that kind of perspective.
Yes. Thank you very much. It's a very important question, because actually the term nature-based solution is being so widely used that it means everything. So it's just like, so I should have defined it. The nature-based solution as a concept, there is not an official definition, or there are several official definitions. It was the one I am talking about. It was pushed by the conservation industry late 2000. And was based on the idea that we can use nature is a magic machine, and we can use it to compensate for or to contribute to the climate change compensation. So I was using it more it was a new way to reframe carbon offsetting, and that is the way that it's mostly used. But there is a lot of other activities that are also called nature-based solutions. And as you say, they have to be with gardening and urbanism and things that are not really linked to my speech on conservation, and they're not linked to compensation or offsetting. They are different. The problem with nature-based solutions is when they are used to offset. So the idea is that we do this so we can do the other. There is nothing bad in doing actually the opposite, to try to have, or I don't know, a garden in the roof of the building. The problem is not that we have to change our infrastructures, of course, to do them more sustainable, to reduce climate emission. But the problem is not that. The problem is when this is being used to allow someone else to keep destroying. It's the offsetting part that is very dangerous. As I said, many other projects. I'm not against it. I do think that there is something very naive sometimes in Europeans in think that they can they can change their way of life by consuming less of something, when in reality it's the entire system that is so wasteful and done in a way to exploit our resources that is difficult to change. But that said, I don't think anything bad in or it's not a problem if people are trying in their own way to live in a more environmental way. The problem, as I said, is when you use that as offset. When you think I'm going to stop using my car, and then instead of and I will use my bike, and then I can sell the carbon or the emissions that I saved by using the bike to McDonald's, so McDonald's can compensate for its emission. Is this exchange in the market, which is called offsetting? That is a very dangerous concept, because it allows the pollution to keep going on. And that is the dangerous part. I don't know if I explained that well.
Hey, thank you so much for all the information that you have shared with us. I'm Alina from Belarus, and I wanted to ask you about your experience of working with indigenous people, because I'm very inspired by all the indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge. But I had one conversation with colleagues from Greenpeace Russia while they were still working, and they've been trying to work with indigenous communities in Russian territory, and they were talking about the specific territory in Siberia. I think it was closer to Kazakhstan. I don't remember exact name of the settlement, but they said that for them it's kind of a bit struggling work, because in that specific area, indigenous people were kind of also selling their land, because they owned some land, but they were selling it to companies for like deforestation issues and everything. And so I don't want to judge anyone and say that this behavior is better or not and everything, but I just wanted to, but I also know like some inspiring example of indigenous people in Ecuador, in Amazon, and also in Canada and North America. So I just wanted to ask about your experience of working with different communities all over the world. And yeah.
Yes, I think it's always very as you said, it's best not to judge, because it's also very difficult to understand the position in which many indigenous peoples are forced to be. So sometimes they are forced to sell the land, and it's the only way that they can arrive at the end of the month, because there is nothing else available, or because, as I said, climate change is having such a huge impact on many lands that they can't live anymore on their land. So it's very important to keep in mind that when we are talking about indigenous people, we are talking about people that have been oppressed and criminalized and by the entire world and the entire legislations. And there is such a important baggage of historical injustice that it's very difficult to judge with the same kind of judgment we will have for someone who is in a privileged position like we are. So I think that's something important to keep in mind, that colonization and oppression has faced the relationships that we have with them so much that we can't pretend that it didn't exist, or we can't use the same kind of judgment. Historical injustice is something that has shaped a lot of these communities. I think that one of the things that, in my experience working with them, is that, of course, we work only with people that want us there. We are not here. We are here to offer people tools when they want to fight with us to defend their territories or their lives. Is that there is it's difficult, of course, because I'm a white person who comes from the West, and they have been cheated so many times and have been deceived so many times that it's also very difficult for me. This is one of the things I find more difficult for my work, that we cannot create expectations. So we are there to help them as we can, but the ones who have to face the consequences of the actions that survival does many times are them, because they are the ones who are there in the territory. If we do an action against the Congolese government is not going to come to Paris to kill me, but they can do that with the people. So we have to be very, very careful, as I said, about the relationship that we create and the expectation, because sometimes we are there to fight with them, but sometimes we don't win the fight. And one of the things I really try to do is to not forget I am dealing with people that, as I said, have been facing oppression, discrimination, racism for a long time. And it's very important to keep that in mind, that we can't forget that happened. But but at the same time, that they are not just victims, that they are people with their strengths and with their courage, and that they have been resilient in a way that I personally could be. So it's for me, this is the two things that one side having in mind the oppression they're facing and remembering the historical injustice, on the other side, not seeing them as victims, because they are human like all of us. So it's possible to laugh, to make jokes. And as I said, they're incredibly resilient. I have been myself spending a lot of time with people that have been victims of rape and the most terrible abuses. And nevertheless, they wake up in the morning and they continue to their life. So it's in the way they can. So I think that that's what I would take from my relationship with them, that they are people like everyone, but at the same time, they belong to people that have been facing so much injustice. So yeah. So I don't know. For me, it's always a very difficult job, but I partially try to keep these two things in mind. And of course, the connection is very important in the sense that we don't go there like other NGOs with the jeep and take pictures and leave. So we live with them. So we also usually stay a couple of months, and we share everything with the community. So we eat with them. We sleep in the villages. We sit down on the floor when they sit down on the floor, because as white person, the first thing that many people will do is giving you a chair. They will bring a chair, and then you will be sitting in the chair and everyone else on the floor. So there are kind of things that happen, unfortunately, because of this colonial past, and we have to keep in mind. We have to keep in mind very well who we are and what the color of the skin is and what we represent for them. But once that you visit a village 1, 2, 3 times and you come back and you didn't forget them, and then they have your phone number, and it's always you that come back. I have been doing this work for 10 years. There is a connection that it created, like with all humans, and this is the most beautiful thing I think about my work. Also, sometimes it's very cruel and sad, because those people, as I said, are facing a lot of injustice, and sometimes they are killed or tortured. But this connection is something that I think is very important. We don't have to forget that this is the reason why we are doing this, is because we care about other humans. And yeah, and I think that relationship helped me also to keep my rage sometimes in place, because sometimes it can be very frustrating to do this job when battles are very difficult to win. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Fiore. I think we are running out of time, so I leave the floor to Massimo to Professor De Marchi for the conclusion.
Okay, many thanks to Fiore, and I think we have a good image of what is happening in many protected areas of the world with the narrative. Just to remember one important element, the history. Kings created the game reserves, okay? And this is somewhat related with the modernity. And then this model was transferred in many parts and now is inside this capitalistic process of conservation for many reasons. I think it is interesting to know this aspect from a biological point of view. Yesterday we reflected on the irrationality from ecological point of view of the separation of area as conserved area. Today we make a reflection from social sciences from one side, and the other side we see example and the voice of people. I think this is the way in which we can know combining different kind of knowledge and real practice. After these 2 days focusing on natural resources in different parts of the world, this afternoon we start to visit what happens inside cities today and tomorrow, and to see how people are fighting inside city to maintain another way of having relation between people and the nature. The problem of nature is not just in Africa, Asia, or in the mountains or in remote area, but is also inside the city, the way we want to live. Many thanks to Fiore, and
thank you for the invitation. It was a
also
pleasure.
think for all students the possibility to think in your eventual internship thesis about these topics. Fiore will share with you the contacts, and so keep in touch, maintain, because this is very important topics to reflect and to practice.
Yes, I realize now that they're all in class, so I don't going to leave my email in the chat because that makes sense. But if you want to pass it to them, I am happy that they have my email in case they want to also connect with me.
Perfect. Perfect. Thanks, Fiore. Good lunch for everybody, and then we meet in a few minutes.
Thank you very much.
Grazie.
Goodbye. Goodbye to everyone.
Thanks and grazie.
Grazie, boy. Ciao.
Ciao.